Many of you know Amy Julia Becker has written a book, A Good and Perfect Gift, Faith Expectations and a Little Girl Named Penny, published by Bethany House, where she talks about the birth and the first years of their daughter with Down syndrome. Some of you have seen the book out there, and it was listed as one of the top 10 religious books in 2011 by Publishers Weekly. And I won't go on because the writing is in the profiles of our speakers. And I just want to encourage us again to hear the stories, to listen to the deeply embedded theology, I would dare to say, in the life stories of people and their families. And so thank you, Amy Julia, for being with us, and I'll turn it over to you. Let's welcome Amy Julia.
It's really fun to be here. I came to this conference 2 years ago just for the first day, simply as a participant. And on some level, I wish I were here in the same capacity now, because this afternoon I have to go to my session. And I don't get to go to hear Rudd or Ellen or any of the other things that are being offered this afternoon. So too bad for me, but I'm really grateful to be here and glad to have a chance to share some of our story. I'm going to be reading a bit from A Good and Perfect Gift and also giving some of the theological thoughts that I had that kind of go along with the book. I don't know if any of you are a reader of Wendell Berry. He's one of my favorite writers, and he writes these novels. And then it's kind of funny because sometimes you read his essays and you think, oh, you were trying to teach me that in that story I just read. And that's a little bit of what I'm hoping to do here, is to share the story, but also some of the thinking that was going on behind it. Not to say that I'm a Wendell Berry, but just to give you some comparison. So I'll start with reading a little bit just from the beginning of A Good and Perfect Gift, and then we'll go from there. This takes place in Princeton, New Jersey in the fall of 2005. If only we had waited. If only I were due in the summer. Then I could have finished school. Then Peter would have 3 months free from teaching. Having this baby in June instead of January. That would make sense. I jerked the car out of the parking lot and rested one hand on top of my round belly. As I drove past a little white church and a deli and a graveyard, I had a thought. And it was so powerful, it was more like hearing than thinking. But if you had waited, then you wouldn't have had this child. And all my objections ceased. You wouldn't have had this child. Chapter 1. You didn't like dolls, my mother said. You would put all your puzzles in a row in the playroom and dump their pieces onto the floor, then put them back together one by one. She shook her head as she unloaded the dishwasher. Then she turned toward me with a smile. The only word you said incorrectly was raisins. Those, for some reason, you called sha-sha. Otherwise, you wouldn't speak unless you could say the word properly. I smiled, a little amused, a little self-conscious. Mom wiped her hands on a dish towel. Her curly brown hair was pulled back with 2 barrettes. Dressed in a Santa Claus sweater and snowflake earrings, she looked her part. Preschool teacher, mother of 4, grandmother-to-be. It was the day after Christmas. I was helping put away the china and silver from dinner the night before, but I soon leaned against the hutch in her kitchen, my hand pressed against my lower back. My belly was a taut globe, an announcement to the world that our child would arrive any day now. Our child, our daughter, Penny. That evening, we all gathered in the attic, a makeshift family room that remained unpainted and without heat, home to old dress-up clothes, rows of National Geographic magazines, an L-shaped couch, and a big screen TV. My sisters, Brooks and Ellie, shared a blanket. Kate curled up in a chair with a cup of hot chocolate. Mom and Dad sat side by side, their bodies not quite touching. I leaned against Peter, his hand resting on me, waiting for the sharp kicks and ripples that always came in the evening. It still seemed mysterious that my body could join with his and form another person, that she would inherit my round cheeks or his dark hair or my grandfather's chin, that she would be ours and yet utterly herself all at the same time. Brooks and Ellie had decided we should watch some old home videos, and they agreed on a series of classics. First, Brooks as a 3-year-old making up a song for the camera, "Why Do I Have to Live in This Canoe?" Then Ellie as a 4-year-old newscaster reporting on the weather. Then the 4 of us that same year, when I was 13, producing a video for Mom and Dad's 20th wedding anniversary as we mimicked their daily routines. And then there I was, 2 years old, with bleached blonde hair and big green eyes, singing a college fight song. In the video, it was summertime, and my mother was pregnant with Kate. Someone asked me when the new baby was coming. "In October," I replied, and then corrected myself with a frown and a shake of the head. In October. Even at age 2, I had to get it exactly right. It had to be perfect. A few days later, Penny was born, December 30th, 2005. She was 2.5 weeks early. My mom had come down. She was actually present for her delivery. My sisters were in the waiting room. And after Penny was born, I didn't know this at the time. I didn't think about it at the time, but apparently the nurses took her away pretty quickly. So my mom started to get a little worried. We were just new parents caught up in the excitement of this birth. But about 2 hours later, a nurse came in and called my husband out of the room. My mom and my sisters were there, but they were on their way out to get us some dinner and come back. So when Peter came back, I was alone in the room, and his eyes had filled with tears. And he said, "The doctors suspect that Penny has Down syndrome." So I'm going to pick up reading really at the end, a few minutes after that, as my mom and my sisters are coming back to the room. I was still sitting there, calm and solemn, when my sisters and mother walked in. I had heard them in the hallway, the cheery cadences of their conversation wafting into the room. But they knew as soon as they saw us. And then the first tear trickled down my cheek. I tried to tell them, but I had to wave in Peter's direction. He said it again. "The doctors think Penny has Down syndrome." Mom nodded, almost as if the news had confirmed a suspicion. Kate's eyes got big. Brooks jerked her head a little as if she had been slapped. Ellie looked at the floor. "May I hold her?" Mom asked. With Penny in her arms, she said, "I knew something was wrong from the way the nurses were looking at each other after the delivery. They kept catching each other's eyes and trying to catch your doctor's eye, and they weren't smiling. And Penny's body didn't look like all of you when you were born. I wondered if she had dislocated her shoulder or something." I thought back to Penny naked, her limbs splayed as they washed her after birth. I hadn't seen it then, but Mom was right. Her body had looked different from those classic images of newborns curled up tight, arms and legs pulled in. "And they took her away so quickly," Mom said. Her voice held relief, as if she had been worried she would return to news far worse. Again, I hadn't thought anything of the timing. I hadn't held Penny for long, but it hadn't struck me as odd. I just didn't know any better. By midnight, I had been awake for almost 24 hours. My family said their goodbyes. Penny nursed again, and Peter curled up to sleep in the fold-out cot next to my bed, his hand resting upon my thigh. A nurse came in. She recorded my temperature and my blood pressure and asked about my pain. I handed Penny to her, and she turned to walk out of the room. Almost as an afterthought, she stepped toward me and said, "I had a special child, too." I couldn't see her face in the dim light. I was lying down, on the edge of sleep. "How old is your child now?" I asked. Her tone stayed the same, even and soothing, when she said, "He died a long time ago." I closed my eyes for a moment. I didn't want it to be true. I said, "I'm sorry." She looked past me and shook her head as if I didn't understand. Before she took her leave, she said, "He was a gift." I think in many ways, this book that I've written and a lot of the thinking I've done is my attempt to understand what that nurse meant when she uttered those 4 words in the hospital, "He was a gift." Because when she first said them, I knew there was something true about them, but I also didn't understand them at all. And I think that was true for two reasons, maybe three. First, because generally when I receive a gift, I immediately feel grateful and excited. And as much as I already adored this baby girl, I was not feeling grateful or excited. I was feeling sad and afraid. Some of that sadness and some of that fear was on her behalf. I was worried about her future already. I was worried about her health. I was worried about what her life was going to be like. But much of that sadness and fear was about me, because I didn't want her to have a disability, but I also didn't want to be the mother of a child with a disability. And I didn't know how I could try to understand her as a gift under those conditions. The second thing was that here I had this nurse who had told me her child had died, clearly younger than she was, and yet she was talking about him as a gift. So there had to be some suffering involved. And so I thought, how can we use this language of gifts at the same time that we are implying or understanding that there's suffering involved? And it seemed to me that some of this language that I had heard before of special children being gifts was just a saccharine attempt to put something positive on something that was really just hard. And when I think back on it, I also realize there's a larger cultural narrative that I certainly had bought into, and that made it really difficult for me to understand Penny as a gift. And I need to tell you a little bit about my life up to that point to have this make sense. Perhaps it's similar to some of yours, but I really had gone through my life with some degree of willful ignorance about disability, and that was true particularly when it came to intellectual disability. I did not know anyone with an intellectual disability, and I had gone through Princeton University, so I knew a lot of people who had a lot of intellectual aptitude. And during my time there, my younger sister, Kate, was at another college, and she had participated in a Best Buddies program. And her best buddy was a woman named Sandra who had Down syndrome. And I remember hearing Kate talking about Sandra, and I was so puzzled by it because Sandra brought her true joy. She loved that they got to go out together. They went to McDonald's, they went to the mall, they talked about boyfriends. They were truly great friends. And I admired that about Kate. I thought it was wonderful, but I wasn't particularly interested in having a relationship like that of my own. So back then I used politically correct language, and I certainly didn't make jokes about disabilities or watch movies that mocked people with disabilities, and I probably felt some degree of pride in those things. But I would also say that I had some degree of careless indifference when it came to people with disabilities. So in these days and hours that followed Penny's birth, I had to confront that fact. I had to ask, why is it that I have avoided people with Down syndrome, with disabilities my entire life? I realized that I'd come into the hospital with a set of expectations about who Penny would be, about what our family would be, and those expectations did not leave any room for a child with a disability. So I started to ask myself a lot of questions, and I started ultimately to question a lot of the cultural assumptions that we have about what our lives are supposed to look like. And so I started to recognize the ways that I had always believed, even though I might have said I didn't believe this, I had always believed that our people that we interact with can be measured by what they can do and by what they can accomplish. So I really had bought into a cultural narrative that says ability equals identity. Ability equals identity. And so then, having been given this child with a disability, not only was I very confused about who she was, but I also began feeling really confused about who I was and about who we might become as a family. So I started to think about this subtle and often unspoken but very real assumption that our lives can be measured by accomplishment and achievement. And I started then to think about what that assumption does, not only to us personally, but to us as a culture. I was raised in the church, and I was raised, I think, to believe that I have an identity in Christ, but I don't think I had any idea what that might mean on a practical level. I had a friend, I remember her once saying in college, I know that Jesus thinks I'm beautiful, but what about the boy who's sitting across the table? That's who I'm concerned with right now. And it was a little bit like that, where it's like, sure, my identity is in Christ. I need to go get another A. Like it just didn't compute. It didn't make sense. So I do think I had this very unchristian belief that I needed to do everything right in order to be acceptable. And I came very close to applying that same belief to my children. So when Penny was first born, it was hard to admit that I had this set of expectations that she probably wouldn't be able to achieve. And it was very hard to admit that I had bought into, again, these images of supermodels, or this idea that our worth as parents can be measured by the SAT scores of our children, or by economic productivity or athletic ability. I remember getting a copy of Parents Magazine in the mail. Someone had given it to me at a baby shower, a subscription. And on the cover it said, will your child be tall, athletic, intelligent? And I threw it away and just didn't look back. But at the same time, I was coming face to face with these expectations, and I was starting to be able to see them for what they were, which was a false and shallow conception of what it means to be human and what it means to understand our identity as human beings. To put this in some religious context, or to put some religious language on it, I would say that our culture idolizes achievement. So not only do we hold it up as a standard, but we assume that if we just work a little harder, earn a little more, do a little better, then we'll be satisfied, then we will get there. But we also know that there's always something more to do, and there's always more money to earn, there's always more awards to win, and there will always be someone else, even then, who does it better. So achievement is just like any other false god. It demands our worship and then gives us emptiness and longing in return. So as it turned out, loving my child with a disability meant that I needed to smash an idol, which is never easy. So I want to pick up reading when Penny was just a few days old. We've come home from the hospital, and my friend called me. All right, here we go. When Virginia called, I was feeling fine. We'd been giggling and taking pictures and were filled with the giddiness of new parents. But I didn't talk to her about how the grief still came every day and knocked me over. How we had been deeply submerged in despair last weekend, and now we were just in up to our necks. So we could breathe, could cry for help, could even get out of the water and onto dry land for a moment or two. I hadn't told her how I thought that someday we might find that the water only reached our hips and we could wade forward, and after that, merely dip a toe in now and again. I hadn't told her how afraid I felt, afraid for the short term, that Penny wouldn't gain weight, that I wasn't feeding her enough, that my milk would dry up, that she would be too hot or too cold or too wet, and afraid for the long term, that she would die early, that she wouldn't be able to live on her own, that she wouldn't ever know deep love from one other person, a husband, that she wouldn't be able to do things she wanted to do, that her joints would be out of whack, that she wouldn't be smart or funny or cute, that other people wouldn't love her, that I wouldn't love her, that we would see her as a burden instead of a blessing. I hadn't told her that it had to get better, the sadness, or I wouldn't survive. Virginia waited through my silence. I finally said, sorry, lost in thought. She said, I'm sure you need to go, but there is one other thing I think I should tell you. When I first got your message, I was so upset. And I don't mean to sound all weird here, and I wasn't sure I was even going to tell you this yet, but I think I should. I was praying for you, and I was reminded of Jesus saying, whoever receives this child receives me. So I looked it up. It's in Mark. I think I was supposed to tell you that. Whoever receives this child. I heard it again, that voice from the fall. But then you wouldn't have had this child. Thank you, I said. Virginia's words stuck with me, and I knew she was right. To the degree that we could receive Penny into our lives, we would be receiving God's work in our lives. It sounded very good in theory, but putting it into practice was another story. And so I'm going to flip ahead and read one more scene that comes closer to the end of the book. This is when Penny was 13 months old. And I certainly was doing a lot better emotionally at that point. But we went on a weekend with Peter's roommates from college and their children. And I'm going to read what happened then. Penny and I let Peter sleep in the morning while we joined the other mothers and children in the kitchen. I plopped Penny onto the floor. Of the 4 other children, 2 were her age and 2 were 6 months younger. I told myself not to make comparisons. But as I watched Ellen Grace, just a few days older than Penny, run from one side of the room to the other, I couldn't contain the feeling of being on an elevator that had lost its connection. I was plummeting down, and there was no way to stop the descent. I turned my attention to the younger ones. I noticed the strength in their bodies, as if their muscles knew how to hold them upright intuitively, whereas Penny's had to be taught what to do to navigate the world. But when I waved to little Simon, he didn't acknowledge me. Penny, on the other hand, responded to my gesture with a wave, a clap, hands up over her head, and then waving again with 2 hands at once. She brought a smile to my face, but I couldn't stop evaluating. All day, I calculated how long it would be until Penny could climb on the couch like the other kids, how long it would be before the younger ones surpassed her. I went to bed that night with a sense of defeat. I had never spent a day with other kids who were so close to Penny in age, and I had never succumbed so fully to the temptation to compare. I thought back to an email that had been forwarded to me a few days earlier. It contrasted spectrum moms, moms with children on the autism spectrum, and soccer moms. It talked about all the noble things we moms of kids with disabilities did, driving to multiple therapists and negotiating school options and figuring out food and exercise and learning for our kids. It was a nice reminder that I wasn't alone, that there were plenty of other parents working out the same issues on behalf of their children. It even reminded me that plenty of parents and children face far more difficult challenges than I did every day. I was uneasy, though, with the tone, a tone I knew I took on when comparing myself with my friends, that same tone of proud self-pity that had hovered over me all day. So on the one hand, I couldn't have been more delighted in who Penny was. When I was home with her, I was not looking up her accomplishments and charting them with a baby book in hand. But then I found myself in this context for the first time, really, of a group of moms who had other kids the same age as her. And I felt like this experience of thinking that ability determines identity smacked me in the face again. And then I realized that understanding identity as something that's based upon ability leads all of us to feel inadequate. Yes, my experience as a parent of a child with a disability was almost a magnified version of general parenting woes, but it's not as if none of the other moms were thinking, I wonder what my kid can do that your kid can't, and vice versa. Whether we are typically developing or with disabilities, when we get into that point of comparison, none of us can measure up. And so I realized, okay, there's one problem that follows this idea that identity leads to ability, and it's just insecurity. And then that leads to a second problem, which is that as we're trying to construct a sense of identity based on ability, we start comparing ourselves to other people. And so we're not only judging ourselves as unworthy, but we're doing the same thing to others. And so as we're making comparisons, whether that's of ourselves or of our children, we go in 2 directions. One, we go towards judgment, thinking I'm doing it better or my kid is doing it better. Or we go towards jealousy, because you're doing it better or your kid is doing it better. And so in that scene I felt that little twinge of jealousy every time I saw these other children able to do things Penny couldn't. And yet I also felt that sense of judgment when I put myself into the category of spectrum moms who are doing all these noble things for our kids. And in either case, what I'm doing is distancing myself from my friends and distancing my daughter from her peers. So either way, judgment or jealousy, the impact of that assumption that identity leads to ability and those comparisons that happen leads to severed relationships, or at least impeded relationships. And so I started to ask myself, is there any other way, not only to understand Penny, but to understand all of us, to understand all these children? As I lay in bed, I realized that the question I'd been asking all day long was, what can she do? And when I asked it of Penny in comparison to the other kids, she came up short every time. But I finally thought to ask, who is she? And I started to remember all the traits that were unique to her. The slobbery kisses, the eyes that followed me around a room, the laughter and sweetness. And when I asked that question of the other kids, I didn't come up with answers based on how they might perform on a test, but answers based upon their personalities. I thought about Ellen Grace wanting to hold her dad's hand whenever he was in the room, or the way Simon reached out his arms for his mother, the way Josie carried her blue teddy bear wherever she went. There was no need to compare the answers to who are you. It was just a way to find the good, the particular, about anyone. And it made me realize that our daughter's character measured up to everyone else's. She couldn't walk or run. 10 years from now, she might not be able to do multiplication tables at the same rate as the other children her age. She might not be reading the same books. But if I thought about her in terms of her character and not some set of competencies, then I could embrace her alongside her peers. We took a photograph of all 5 kids on the sofa the next morning. The parents swarmed the room with cameras and exaggerated happiness. One by one, each of our children began to cry until all 5 of them were in the arms of a mother or father. They weren't that different, after all. I had a conversation with one of those moms, actually shortly after Penny was born. She's got a daughter named Sophie who's 4 months older than Penny. And I remember saying, I want to be able to celebrate when Sophie accomplishes something. I want to celebrate when she wins her track meet or when she throws a ball or whatever it is, instead of always feeling a tension about who she is in comparison to Penny, what she can do in comparison to Penny. And that paradigm shift, going from what can she do to who is she, has certainly helped me to do that, to celebrate who Penny is, but also to be able to celebrate the achievements and the accomplishments of my friends' children without thinking that those achievements and accomplishments are what makes those children valuable or beloved. Because if we can start to see not only our children, but also ourselves for who we are instead of for what we can accomplish, then comparisons take on a different tone. So we can actually be drawn toward each other in our diversity of abilities instead of pushed away from each other in that place. So if we can understand identity not as a reflection of ability, but as a reflection of relationship, of the reality that we are all people who love, we are all people who are loved in return, then our lives begin to be marked by love instead of being marked by performance, marked by the freedom to enjoy one another rather than the constraints, the competition, and the comparisons of achievement. Again, all parents face these problems. I was reading a New Yorker article the other day. It's a book review about kind of high-level parenting of very achievement-oriented kids, and I just wanted to read this passage. It's a book, A Nation of Wimps, The High Cost of Invasive Parenting. So in this book, Morano argues that college rankings are ultimately to blame for what ails the American family. Her argument runs more or less as followed. High-powered parents worry that the economic opportunities for their children are shrinking. They see a degree from a top-tier school as one of the few ways to give their kids a jump on the competition. In order to secure this advantage, they will do pretty much anything, which means not just taking care of all the cooking and cleaning, but also helping their children with math homework, hiring them SAT tutors, and, if necessary, suing their high school. Morano, an editor-at-large at Psychology Today, tells about a high school in Washington State that required students to write an 8-page paper and present a 10-minute oral report before graduating. When one senior got a failing grade on his project, his parents hired a lawyer. Today's parents are not just helicopter parents, a former school principal complains to Morano. They are a jet-powered turbo attack model. Other educators gripe about snowplow parents who try to clear every obstacle from their children's paths. The products of all this hovering, meanwhile, worry that they may not be able to manage college in the absence of household help. According to research conducted by sociologists at Boston College, today's incoming freshmen are less likely to be concerned about the rigors of higher education than about how they will handle the logistics of everyday life. All that is to say, parents of typically developing children face a set of pressures about giving their kids, again, these abilities to achieve. And they, again, fall into this trap of understanding their children as in terms of what they can do instead of who they are. And we can do the same thing as a parent of a child with disabilities, right? The pressures about getting the proper therapies and about advocating for your child in front of bureaucracies and having super endearing stories to tell at gatherings like this to show that it's all working out for you too, right? So across the board, I think we face this problem of comparisons. I was talking about this theme in a different context earlier this year, and I had a mom of a preschooler say, okay, I'm tracking with you in theory, but it is so much easier for me to tell you what my child can do than it is to tell you who he is. And I do think she's right about that. Charts and graphs and measurements are easier, and I think that's one of the reasons we default to them. They're more concrete and they're more precise. But I do think it's possible to discover who we are and who our children are. And I think we begin with the love that exists between parent and child. And not just the love, the reciprocal love that's on that emotional level, but also just thinking about what it is that our children love. And for infants, that might be loving bubbles or splashing in a bathtub. For toddlers, it might be loving animals or chicken nuggets. And then as kids get older, of course, it might be a love for dancing or music or climbing on the playground or getting up and going to work in the morning. As I've said before, if ability is our measure for our identity, for our belovedness, right? If what we can do means that we are loved, then every one of us falls short. But if our identity comes out of the fact that we are loved, then the diversity of our abilities becomes not an opportunity to measure and judge, but to celebrate and to give and receive from one another. And in a gathering where many people are Christians, I'm able to talk not just about the love between a parent and child, which I do think gets us a lot farther than the idea that our belovedness comes from what we can achieve. But I can actually talk about the love of God and the love that God has for each and every one of God's children. And I think about this God who, in the Bible, we are told, has love that never fails. This God who is actually defined by love. A God who exists in relationship already, in a trinity of Father, Son, and Spirit, in a relationship that is actually fueled by love, by mutual giving and receiving. The whole Christian story is a story of God inviting us into love, inviting us to understand our own belovedness and to see and to begin to see the belovedness of those around us. And that's even our task, to see and demonstrate God's love to the world through other people. So knowing ourselves first and foremost as God's beloved offers a bedrock for our identity and then enables us to extend that love and begin to see the belovedness of the other. I believed 2 lies, at least, when Penny was born. And I've talked about one of them, which is that I believed her identity was determined by her abilities. And so I entered into my own identity crisis on her behalf. And I think I've come out of that crisis with a better understanding not only of who she is, but also of who I am and who my other children are. And honestly, every human being I encounter, who they are too. But I also believed another lie when I found out that Penny had Down syndrome. I also believed that because she had received this label of disability, she would not be able to contribute much to the world around her. She didn't have much to offer. I thought of her as someone who was needy and limited, and I thought that was the end of the story. I thought that she would not be someone who was able to give back. But I was wrong. I was wrong about Penny, and I was wrong about people with disabilities more generally. So I can't stand here and say what each person in this room is capable of doing or what your children are capable of doing, but I can say this, that every person in this room has limitations. And every person in this room has possibilities for growth and for learning. That's true of all of us. So we have limitations and we have possibilities. And I wonder whether a better way to talk about the possibilities and perhaps the limitations as well is to return to this language of gifts. Because I've come to believe and to recognize not only that human beings are gifts to one another in some general sense, but also that human beings have gifts to offer. Everyone has particular gifts, and some of those gifts can be measured, right? The person who has a gift with numbers and can get an 800 on the SAT, that portion of the SAT, you can measure that. You can measure the person who is a gifted athlete and can throw three-pointers all day long. But sometimes, and often, I believe our gifts are immeasurable, and often they go unnoticed. I remember when I was first thinking about this, our son William was an infant. He was about 6 months old, and he was a tough baby, actually much harder than Penny had been. He squirmed, he wriggled, he just was not comfortable. He cried all the time, he wanted to eat all the time. He just was never kind of comfortable in his own skin. And around the time that he was 6 months old, we had invited a family who had adopted 3 children as infants with Down syndrome. They now were teenagers. And Maggie was one of these kids. And she came over. She was largely nonverbal, had a few words and a few signs, but was not able to communicate through speech or sign language in any complex way. She was very polite. She carried a doll around her with her the whole time. And I'm sitting there trying to apply this new theory. I want to know who is she instead of what can she do. And it wasn't really working because I was coming up with all these things that she couldn't do. She can't write, she can't drive a car, she can't have a conversation with me. But I kept wanting to know, who is she? Well, I know there's something more here. About 2 hours into our time together, we were sitting in our playroom, and I happened to look over, and there was my son lying on his back, gazing at Maggie as she stroked his cheek. And he lay there in the most peaceful position I had honestly ever seen him in his 6 months of life, just looking at her for about 10 minutes. And so I thought about it, and there was a part of me that thought, okay, I was just trying to come up with an answer to satisfy my theory that everyone has a gift, right? Did this really happen? And so I mentioned it to her mom later. I said, it was really neat. I saw Maggie have this interaction with William. This is what William's usually like. And she said to me, without knowing my story behind it, she said, oh, that's Maggie's gift. And I said, what do you mean? And she told me a series of stories of the time when Maggie was a young girl and had gone over to a member of their congregation and just climbed into her lap. And her parents came in to find this woman with tears streaming down her cheeks because Maggie was ministering to her. Maggie was caring for her with no words, but simply by having a spirit that understood that this woman was in need of some comfort. She told another story of a woman in a nursing home who was actually prone to kind of abusive language and slapping people away when they came to touch her. Maggie went straight up to her when they were visiting some other folks in the nursing home, put her hand on her arm, and the woman slapped her away. And she did it again and again and again until the woman quieted down and was willing to receive her care. So it wasn't just me trying to take this idea that people have gifts and are gifts. It was actually true about her. And because I wanted to see it, I wanted to believe it, I wanted to know who she was, it took 2 hours. It took a long time of being together before I was able to see. But then I just was in awe of this young woman and of her incredible abilities and of what she had to offer. A few years earlier, I don't think I would have been able to see that at all. I think I would have seen Maggie as someone who needed me. I don't think that I would have ever known that I really needed her as well. Having Penny in my life has begun to teach me how to look for gifts in every person that I encounter, and has helped me to begin to understand this truth that our identity comes from being loved and not from being able to achieve or perform. I looked it up in the dictionary, and a gift is something bestowed or acquired without any particular effort by the recipient and without its being earned. They also say it's a special ability or capacity, a natural endowment or talent. Maggie's gift is her presence. And people now ask me about Penny, and it's interesting. She's 6 years old now. The book ends when she's about 2.5. And I can talk about her struggles, right? I can explain that her biggest challenges are behavioral. She's very impulsive. So every day we talk about quiet hands and listening ears. I can talk about her skills. I can say these are the things she's able to do. She's able to read. She's able to write. She loves playing with her friends. But it's really her gifts that I think bring the most joy to our family, and those, again, are more intangible. It's hard, even as I was writing this talk, to figure out how to put them on paper, Because again, her gifts are a gift of presence, a gift of caring for people and who they are and what they're doing. The one story I came up with to try and offer, earlier this spring, our babysitter broke her foot. And she was unable to come to work for about the next 8 weeks. And about 3 weeks into that time, so after the drama of it had subsided and we had a replacement who was coming a couple hours a day, Penny woke up in the morning, and almost every morning, as soon as she wakes up, she comes straight into our room and just says hello, and we remind her she needs to go to the potty and find a book to read, because we stay in bed. And so this morning, I noticed, because I saw her walking down the hall, and she didn't come into our room, and I thought, I wonder what she's doing. I'll give her a few minutes. And she came back into the room with a paper in hand. She had gotten a paper, and she'd gotten a marker, and wrote in her writing, "Dear Shannon, I hope your foot feels better. Love, Penny." And what struck me about that was the first thing she thought of when she woke up in the morning. We had not spoken about Shannon in weeks. It had happened 3 weeks earlier, but that was who was on her heart and what was on her mind as soon as she got up out of bed, was just this ability to always be thinking about other people and expressing a genuine care and concern for them. How often do I have a thought about someone else and not write them the note that says, I was thinking about you today? But I have this daughter who does that, and I'm really, really grateful for her. Penny has gifts that other people need, and that's true of every person in this room, and that's true of every child represented by every parent in this room. And in a society that focuses on achievement and abilities, it's really easy to overlook those gifts. And yet, it's also easy to see them and receive them when we're able to look at each other through the eyes of love. So I go back to that nurse in the hospital and I think, yes, her son was a gift, just as our daughter and your sons and daughters are gifts. I mentioned earlier that when Penny was born, I was neither grateful nor excited about having a child with Down syndrome. But I can now say with confidence and certainty that I'm incredibly excited about watching Penny's life unfold, and I'm incredibly grateful for her. And I'm also eternally grateful for the many surprises that her life has contained, one of those being my own gradual transformation from someone who sees the world through the lens of achievement to someone who is beginning to see the world through the lens of love. Thank you. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you very much for being so transparent and open about your own journey and the giftedness of your daughter, and for helping us see the goodness beyond simple achievements, being rather than doing, and that being comes in relationship. And for gifts, even in hardship, I liked how you acknowledged that giftedness isn't pretty or isn't easy. Saccharine was your word. So thank you for those reflections. And let's open it up for conversation. We have about 20 minutes if my cell phone is right in time. So Lynn, is there a mic? Thank you. I'll let you moderate if that's
Sounds good.
okay.
Yeah,
Sorry.
that's great. No.
Amy, thank you very much
Sure.
for your story. It was inspiring. Thank you. One of the things you didn't mention in your story is the place of a faith community.
Mhm.
And I don't know if you're part of a
Yeah.
faith community, but I'm wondering, did they have a role in your transformation, and how was that? Would there have been things before Penny was born that might have helped your transformation?
Those are a series of great questions. So yes, I actually was a student at Princeton Seminary when Penny was born and was interning with our local church, our home church, at that time. And so our community was very receptive and loving to us as a family, but at the same time, I would say, as someone who was already theologically minded, that my problem were problems of theology. And this is a part of the book that I didn't read, but literally in the hospital, I asked the question, is Down syndrome a manifestation of sin in the world? because I've always thought that it was, and that is not making sense of this experience. Like, this theology is not helping me now, but I'm not willing to just throw it out the window simply because it's not helping me. Because if it's true, then I need to figure that out. And so honestly, there are a number of people sitting in this room who were my companions in this journey of transformation in terms of reading Vulnerable Communion and reading Receiving the Gift of Friendship and a series of Stanley Hauerwas's books, and Henry Nouwen, a lot of those, they were my companions on the kind of intellectual piece. On the experience of receiving Penny, we certainly had a local church that began exactly as they should, which was they brought us a lot of meals and prayed for us. And I was not really ready to receive anything else. Or even to be talking about some of the questions I was asking because I was afraid of the answers I might receive. And we didn't go back to church for about 2 months. Part of that was I didn't want Penny to be exposed to germs. It was winter. She had Down syndrome. But part of it was that I felt too vulnerable. It just felt too soon. But I also, in those times, I did not feel. Prayer was very scary. It was really hard for me to pray. I was able to journal, but I wasn't able to take that next step. And I really felt as though it was the church's job to carry that for us, to be the ones who prayed for us. And I felt this great freedom. I did not feel guilt about not praying. I actually felt like this is me being needy and needing other people to do this thing I've always believed in but can't do right now. And that was actually a really beautiful experience. There came a time where it was like, okay, time for you to pray now, and I write about that a bit as well in the book. So as far as preparation, I don't know if I would have had ears to hear it, but I hope that I would have. I feel like on a general level, having conversations again about giving and receiving, about understanding one another through the eyes of love instead of achievement, that those are things the church can be talking about that are really offering freedom whoever we are. My husband and I did a parenting class at our church this year, and there were a few parents of children with disabilities, but actually, in some ways, if you're a parent of a child with disability, you have to think about this stuff. You are forced into it. If you're a parent of a typically developing kid, there's this part of you that says, I probably should be thinking about how much pressure I'm going to put on my kid and whether, but you don't have to because they're doing fine in school and maybe they're on the JV sports team, but they're kind of plodding right along, so you don't have to. And so it actually, in some level, it's the parents who don't have kids with disabilities who need the most help in thinking through some of these things. At least that's what I've found. I was forced there, but it's been such a gift, honestly, to my other kids for me not to be thinking, I know who you're going to be when you grow up because you are my son. And it's like, gosh, there's so much freedom to try and explore who William's going to be, who Marilee's going to be, because of what we learned about Penny. So I do think some of that groundwork could have been laid, although it still would have been making the abstract real that is just the reality of coming into an experience, for any of us. Does that answer your question? At least begin to? So, okay. Yeah.
You talked a little bit about the first hours when Penny was born, and thinking of, I'm wondering how the hospital staff could have shared the information in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
Thinking what you would have liked to hear, thinking what advice you give to people who are in that position of sharing genetic information.
Sure.
What are your thoughts on that?
What happened in our situation was that a nurse called Peter out of the room, so I was left in the room alone, and then he was taken into a storage closet where there was lots of unused equipment. It was a large storage closet, but still a storage closet, with two doctors who we had never met before, who told him that they thought our daughter had Down syndrome, and he came back to tell us that. Pretty much like standard operating procedure, in a manual would say, if you can keep the family together, you want to do that. And they could have. Penny actually was quite healthy when she was born. So, she came home from the hospital 2 days later. she was doing fine. So she could have been in the room with us, and certainly we could have been together. It's one thing if you've had like an emergency C-section or your kid's in the NICU or whatever else, but that was not our situation. So I do think that's would have been a really good place to start. The other thing, and this is something, the doctors were clearly incredibly uncomfortable with the news they were giving us. Actually, he became a beloved pediatrician, but I mean, he was like sweating buckets, and it was so. And I think for two reasons. One, it's just uncomfortable. They don't. A pediatrician necessarily doesn't deliver this news all that often. But I also think they thought they were telling us really, really bad news. We came to understand that news not as really, really bad news. And I think I talked to we have a number of friends, as it happens, who are pediatricians, and we talked to them about this, and they say, yeah, I now, knowing Penny, I could deliver this news without it being a tragedy. And I could say, yes, there are some medical concerns, and we're going to need to think about that. I can also tell you that my friend has a daughter with Down syndrome, and she's great. But they would go into it with that attitude because of the personal. So I think one of my recommendations for any healthcare provider who might find themselves in that position, whether it's prenatally or postnatally, or, along the lines, is to actually know people and families with disabilities. One of the things that Robert Wood Johnson does, the medical school there, is they have 2 days when their residents are doing their pediatric rotation, where they have a day to learn about disabilities, but then they have to go eat dinner with a family with a child with disabilities. So we've had a number of residents over to our house, and they've been very candid with us. One of them said, I thought Down syndrome was the worst possible thing that could ever happen to a family. And now I've spent this evening with you, and I think I could do this. This is a full life. This is a good life, So I think that's actually probably, sure, there are some kind of technical things that would have made it better, having us all in the room together, having, accurate information to provide. But it's more that sense of believing that this is not a tragedy, even though there's some hardship that might be involved. Sure.
So you know that identity is not based on ability, and now we all do, so thank you very much for that. Awesome. But my question is, how do you deal with it when you know that other people are viewing Penny and your family that way?
Yeah, that is a great question. I often feel with Penny that, kind of how I did with that story I told about Maggie, it might take longer for people to be able to see her for who she is. And that, as a result, many people are going to miss out on that. And that's just a reality, and I wish it weren't so, but it is. I am almost, I feel like my husband and I have made a decision to be more public than we should be with our family as a result of wanting, so I have a blog, I put pictures of my children on this blog all the time. There are pictures of them on AOL News and on the Huffington Post, and people are like, aren't you worried about that? And I'm like, you know what, I'm more worried about people who can't see that we have a happy family, that Penny has a good life. And so I'm willing to throw it out there all the time. So I feel like I can't really address that directly. I can't do something that's going to actually convince the people who think that, I should have done prenatal testing and had an abortion. I can't change that, but I can tell our story, and I can tell that it is a good story, and that I'm not alone, that I know countless other families who can't tell the same story because their kid is an individual, not just some kid in a blanket sense with Down syndrome, but their kid is an individual with great gifts to offer. And so I think the best thing that each of us can do is to actually live out of that reality and out of that freedom, because there is something attractive to it. Even at the same time as there's something really confusing about it to the rest of the world. You're welcome. Thank you.
Okay, my question is,
Wait, I'm not seeing. Where am I?
right here.
Oh, sorry. Couldn't find you.
Okay, first of all, thank you for your story. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And second of all, so far, how have you found navigating the school system with Penny?
So Our experience so far has actually been really good. We just moved from New Jersey to Connecticut. And when we were in New Jersey, Penny was in an inclusive preschool setting. So there were about 8 kids who were typically developing, and then about 8 who had some sort of special needs. They had 2 teachers and an aide for the classroom. And what was really interesting was the language they used in describing their program. I saw a similar program in Connecticut. I should start by saying that described their program as, we have typically developing peers who are role models for our students with disabilities. In New Jersey, they said, we have typically developing peers and students with disabilities who teach one another how to be friends. And it was a really, really different linguistic choice that I really appreciated about our school in New Jersey. And that continued through kindergarten, that she was in that classroom setting. What's interesting, however, and I was just talking with someone about this earlier, New Jersey has actually some of the worst track record as far as inclusion. And that's what would have happened to Penny next year. If we had stayed in New Jersey, they would have wanted to put her in a self-contained class. And I would have fought that, and it would have been very unfortunate because I love her school and I love her teachers but that's the way the system is structured in New Jersey, is that you have these resources that go into self-contained classrooms, not into the classroom to allow for integration. We happen to be moving to a 4,000 person town in Connecticut. So there is one first grade classroom, and Penny will be in it, which actually in our case is really great, I think. I am working with the school district to make sure that that teacher has the support she needs to have a kid who, she can do a worksheet, but only if you say, and now you have to do number 2. Okay, and that, so she does need support, and it can't all come from the teacher with 20 kids in the class. But so it kind of remains to be seen. We're pretty early on in the school battle. I hope it's not a battle. I'm trying to see that in a reciprocal way, that we want Penny not only to benefit from her opportunities in this classroom, but to be a blessing to other people in terms of friendships and relationships and learning and all of that. So again, this is a place where I'm trying to take my theory about schools and inclusion and make it work on the ground and in reality. But we have a long way to go to see if we can figure that out. The irony is Penny actually is very academically minded. One of the scenes I have in the book is of me having to let go of the idea of having a child who will share my love for books. And the irony is that Penny wakes up in the morning, walks downstairs, sits on the couch, and starts reading out loud to herself because of how much she loves books. And that's what she got up in front of her kindergarten class at the end of the year and read out loud. They each had to write things. And my favorite place in school is the library. I love to read books. I love reading time. And that is, as it turns out, she is her mother's daughter. So it's not as much the kind of academic piece of school that concerns me so much as the behavioral and social and really helping her make friends, and we'll see how it goes. All right.
Maybe one more question. I have a friend who just gave birth to one of my closest friends. Her friend just gave birth to a baby with Down syndrome, and they have 3 children, and the husband did not want another child to begin with. So they gave birth to this little girl. Her name is Amy, actually, and the mother is doing okay with it.
Yeah.
The father is slowly coming on board. They belong to a strong faith community. I'm trying to figure out, I'm a special educator, and I don't have my own children. I'm trying to figure out how can I walk alongside this mother. Do you have any suggestions for me? It was right about the time that Bill Valenta gave me this book, and I was reading it, trying to figure out, do I give this book to her?
Right.
Feels a little early to do that.
Yeah.
What would you suggest for those of us who do not have children and yet want to be a support to that family?
Especially when you've got like 3 other kids involved, I do think there's some really practical ways to support. That this child is going to have more doctor's appointments, and even literally being like, hey, I know that with Down syndrome comes some more doctor's appointments. Could I keep your other kids while you're taking her to the ear doctor or the eye doctor or whatever? Like, that's just a really practical instead of how can I help, but like, you know that that's something you could help with. I think, and similarly, as far as like, there are going to be a lot of therapy visits, and for that mom to feel like she's actually freed up to participate in that instead of being like, I'm trying to manage this household. Because I had, in having Penny as my first, it made a lot of that, just the navigating, really the first 3 years, it just is a ton of appointments. Once you get into school, there's some different issues to face, but a lot of care is shared now, and teaching and learning and all of that. So that would be just one like really practical way. I think the other thing, I just appreciated people's honesty. So it was really refreshing, and this would not be your situation, but it was really refreshing for me when people said, I don't know anything about Down syndrome, but I know that I love you and I know I love your daughter. When people told me what I was supposed to think or what they already knew, that was not so helpful, because I was like, yeah, but that, I was talking actually with a friend earlier who has a child with a different disability, but where it's like, oh yeah, but every kid suffers. Every kid has struggles. And I'm like, well, yes, there's like a general pool of suffering and struggle, and we don't know which part of it is going to hit our various kids. Penny is in that pool, and I know that she is going to have trouble in X, Y, and Z area. Like, it's like she has this additional, and so it's not really helpful for you to tell me, oh, every parent deals with this, so all that is to say, I think honesty about what you don't know, as well as like a willingness to provide very practical support, is really helpful. And then I think, it's interesting as far as like books and resources. I think people are different. I've had countless pregnant moms who've had a prenatal diagnosis and have really appreciated this book. And then there's also I'm not there yet. The nice thing about a book, though, is that you can put it down. You can read the first couple of pages and say, this is way too much. And, I know for me, I had read Expecting Adam, which is another memoir about a mother who has a baby with Down syndrome. I had read it actually 2 years before Penny was born. And that was the first thing I did when I got home from the hospital, was read it again. And then every other, I'm a reader, and so every other book I could find. But that was really helpful for me. So, I do think that just is gauging the person and the individual. What would be helpful? One thing I really loved, there's a book called Celebrating Life with Down Syndrome, and it's just a big kind of coffee table book of photos and nice stories about families and kids. And I was like, I do not want any more medical information about what might go wrong with my kid. But pictures and stories of friendships and family relationships that are going well and are just normal achievements and accomplishments and, enjoyment of life together, that was really nice. So, a couple of things. All right, I'm done. Thank you.